Hello and welcome to Computer Side Chat number 3. It is a late Tuesday night. We just finished parent-teacher conferences, so I am going to try my best to get through this as quickly as possible. So, for the last week, we have been focusing on what we've referred to as the traits of U.S. government. Now, we define these as characteristics of early American colonial government that have carried over to our government today. Then, for the past few days, we've looked at the early documents that influenced those traits and pushed colonial leaders to including those things in their governments. Now we want to look at why the colonies will unite and go from the colonies of America to the United States of America. So we're going to look at the reasons for that, and then we're going to take a look at what does the first government in the United States look like, specifically under our first Constitution, known as the Articles of Confederation. We're going to look at how that government was structured and why it didn't work. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So, before we can talk about Declaration of Independence and us breaking away, we need to talk about the event that triggered this whole snowball effect of us breaking away from the British Empire. And that event is something known as the French and Indian War. So what was this? Well, this was a war between Britain and France that was fought over land in modern-day Pennsylvania and Ohio. In other words, Britain and France are fighting over territory. Now, the details of the war are not important, although it is worth mentioning that a young American officer by the name of George Washington is going to make a name for himself during this war. We don't really care about the details. We just want to know what happened in the end. And the result of this war is that Britain wins. However, they walk away from the war with a tremendous amount of debt. It ends up being incredibly expensive, and Britain now has to pay that off. Now, it's worth mentioning here that in the previous set of notes, we had talked about the fact that the Americas were unique in the sense that Britain largely left their colonies there alone. They let them do their own thing and govern themselves as long as they continued to make money. Well, Britain's new king, a guy named George III, decides that he wants to change that. He wants to play a more active role in the American colonies, and he sees the war debt issue as an opportunity to do this. So George decides to handle this by taking more control of the colonies and levying taxes on the colonists to pay back the debt. Now, before we move forward to what those taxes looked like and what the response was, it's worth mentioning one more thing from the French and Indian War, and that's something known as the Albany Plan. Now, the Albany Plan is a plan to unite all 13 colonies against France that would be led by a group of representatives from all 13 colonies. This plan was created by Benjamin Franklin, and although the plan is rejected, it is still important. And it's important because it laid the framework for how the colonies might function as one if they were ever to join together. Obviously, that's going to become pretty important here in the near future. So it gives a plan for how a united colonies would work. Now, let's take a look at some of those taxes that George puts in place. So, these taxes do not make the colonists happy. And why they're unhappy about them is something we'll look at in more detail in class. But all you need to know for right now is these decisions are going to lead to incredible tension between the colonies and Britain. Now, the three main things we're going to care about are these. The first thing that causes this tension is something known as the Stamp Act. And this was a tax on all legal documents, newspapers, dice, playing cards, and other goods that the colonists were forced to pay. The next major event was the Boston Massacre, and this was the killing of 5 colonists at the hands of British soldiers during a protest. Lastly is something known as the Intolerable Acts, and this was a set of laws that took actions such as outlawing self-government in Massachusetts, in other words, disbanding the government of Massachusetts, and only allowing British officials to be tried in Britain, even if they were stationed in the colonies. In other words, if a British official stationed in Maryland breaks a law, rather than being put on trial in the colonies, he will be shipped back to Britain to be put on trial there. So this upsets the colonists greatly, and the impact is that colonists begin seeing themselves more as Americans than as British subjects. So all of these actions taken by the king causes Americans to go further and further away from this idea that they are in fact British subjects, and more towards the idea that no, I am a Virginian, or I am from Massachusetts, or I am from Maine, and so on and so forth. So colonists feel this sense of independence from Britain, and they're spurred to action by it. So what is the response from the colonists? The first major response is something called the Stamp Act Congress. And this was the first organized protest against Britain that argued to the king that only colonial legislatures can impose taxes on colonists. So this was a semi-united effort by some of the colonies to basically petition the king saying that you cannot tax us. That is only something that we can make decisions on. It is up to us to decide if a tax is put in place. Secondly is something known as the Committees of Correspondence. As tensions rise and as the British tighten their grip on the colonies, the various colonies stay in contact through these committees. And so it is a way for colonists to stay in contact and organize resistance against the British. Lastly, and most importantly, is the First Continental Congress. And this is the first unified meeting of all 13 colonies. All 13 colonies send representatives to the First Continental Congress, and they all agree that all 13 colonies shall place an embargo or boycott on British goods. In other words, the colonies will not buy or trade for British goods. Again, this keeps snowballing. Tensions keep rising and rising and rising, and this dispute eventually escalates into flat-out war. And so we see that war start at Lexington and Concord with an event known as the Shot Heard Round the World. And so these two places are important because it is here that the first shots of the Revolutionary War are fired. Colonists and the British Army clash for the first time. Shortly after this, the Second Continental Congress convenes. And again, all 13 colonies send delegates and representatives, and the first decision they make at the Second Continental Congress is that they will create an army formed from soldiers from all 13 colonies, and that army will be commanded by George Washington. So that's the first major thing the Second Continental Congress does. Shortly after that, all 13 colonies will vote on a resolution for independence. And again, that is passed by all 13 colonies. And so we are officially an independent nation. And we make that independence official with a document known as the Declaration of Independence. So you already know a lot about the Declaration of Independence. I'm sure you've heard of it. We will go more in depth into it tomorrow. What we need to know right now is have a formal definition for it. So this was a document written by Thomas Jefferson, and this document declared the American colonies to be free of British control. Furthermore, it outlined the grievances Americans had with the British, as well as explained the basic ideas behind what Americans thought government should look like. So it declared independence. It listed all the reasons why we were declaring independence, and it explained what we believed government should look like and how government should function. Now, that's going to really be the end of our focus on the war itself. The events of the war you've covered in the past, and this really isn't a history class. So we're going to go the other way and take a look at what is government going to look like in the now independent United States. And so the first government that we will create will be under a constitution known as the Articles of Confederation. So what was it? Well, like I just said, it is the first constitution of the independent America. And it largely kept government the way it was under the Second Continental Congress. So not much was changed by the framers of this first constitution. They wanted to keep things the way they were, with 13 colonial governments and a central government that made some decisions for them. So let's get into the details of that. What does that look like in particular? Well, first, the federal government under the Articles of Confederation called for a unicameral Congress. So let's break down those two words. Congress is a word I've used a few times now, and very simply, Congress is a legislative body in charge of making laws. So it is the name we give to our legislative branch. That is all Congress is. Now, what does unicameral mean? Well, unicameral means that Congress isn't split up. There is one section or one house or one chamber of Congress. They vote on laws and the majority rules. That is what a unicameral Congress is. Now, when we get to the U.S. Constitution and we look at our government today, we currently have what is known as a bicameral Congress. That means Congress is split in two. There are two chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Why we did that and what purpose that serves, we'll get to later. All you need to know right now is the Articles of Confederation called for a unicameral Congress, one House, 13 votes, majority rules. So secondly, and I kind of just already said it, each state has one vote in Congress. So 13 states, one vote each. That means all votes are equal. I have the same amount of say as the representative from the state of Rhode Island as the representative from the state of Virginia. Again, Rhode Island, a very tiny state, Virginia, a relatively large state, yet our vote counts for exactly the same. That's going to bring up some questions later. But for right now, all we need to know is that there is one vote for each state. Lastly, the national government controls two things: defense, in other words, the military, and foreign affairs, or in other words, interactions with foreign countries. That is it. Everything else is decided by the individual states themselves. They make all other decisions. So what are the weaknesses that might come with that government, or what are some problems that might arise? Well, let's look at the 5 major weaknesses. The first is the fact that the federal government has no power to levy or create taxes. That's an issue because government needs money to function, and if I can't create taxes as the head of federal government, there's not really going to be any money to do anything. Furthermore, Congress could not regulate trade. So that means trade is not uniform throughout the states. If I am the country of Spain and I go to trade with Virginia, the standards and the laws that come with trading with Virginia are going to be completely different from the standards of trading with the state of Massachusetts. So that's another issue, is it's going to complicate trade with other countries. Next, Congress has no executive branch. In other words, they have no branch that enforces laws. So Congress can pass a law, sure, but they have no way to uphold it or enforce that law or make sure it's being followed. Fourth, in Congress, 9 out of 13 states have to vote to pass a law. If they want to amend the Constitution, all 13 states must vote for it. So to pass a law, you need what is called a supermajority. 9 out of 13 states must vote. And to amend the Constitution, you need a unanimous vote. That's going to make it really difficult to get things done. Lastly, there is no federal court system. And this is going to be a problem when it comes to solving disputes. If there is no federal court system and there's a dispute that needs to be solved at the federal level, there is no way to do it. So these weaknesses are going to lead to some various problems arising. So the first problem that's going to arise are going to deal with boundary disputes. So, like we just said, there's no federal courts. And without federal courts, the federal government has no way of solving disputes between two states over a piece of land or a territory. Those states have to solve that issue themselves. Secondly, a problem arises with tariffs. Tariffs being a tax on imported and exported goods. Like I said, Congress can't levy taxes, so the government can't gain money that way. Well, now they can't import tariffs as well, so they can't get money from trade. So again, we have a money issue. Government can't raise money. This is going to be a big problem because we just fought a major war for independence, and so we have a lot of war debt. And so with no ability to raise money, Congress has no way of paying off its debts. So that's another big problem. It's also not going to be able to pay soldiers' salaries, and that's going to be a problem with the next and probably most important problem that's going to arise, and that's going to be something called Shays' Rebellion. So what is Shays' Rebellion? Well, like I just mentioned, Congress is basically unable to pay for anything or raise any type of money. So no trade, no taxes, no tariffs, no ability to pay off debt or soldiers' salaries. Suddenly we're in a situation where early in its infancy, the United States has a major economic crisis. It's not able to deal with any of these issues. And so this economic crisis ends up affecting the citizens themselves. Citizens are starting to lose jobs, lose money. Soldiers from the war are not getting paid. And so they're starting to lose their homes and their farms. And so protests are popping up all across the country protesting this fact. The most important protest, though, arises in Massachusetts. And this is what people think of when they think of Shays' Rebellion. So what is this? Well, it is a rebellion that sparks in Massachusetts over the foreclosure on farms and homes. I believe it was something around like 1,500 people rise up in Massachusetts and try to take control of the state arsenal, basically state weaponry. Massachusetts is able to raise its militia and put down this rebellion. However, this is really kind of the final straw, and you're going to want to make sure you include this in your description of Shays' Rebellion. It really sent alarm bells to the heads of government in the United States that something needs to change. Congress's inability to deal with these financial issues has now started to lead to rebellions across the state. And so the question comes up, is this government working? And the answer really seems like no. So, from here, we're going to take a deeper look at the Declaration of Independence, as well as at why things like the Stamp Act were such a big deal to colonists. From there, we will move on to our next set of notes that will answer the question of, is this government working, and what is going to be the response from citizens of the United States when that answer is no. Remember to take the quizzes after you finish your notes. Have a great night, and I will see you tomorrow.